really excited about. We talked about doing this subject a while ago, and then we kind of fell off. And so I'm glad that we brought it back. And it's all about transracial adoptees. So we have an amazing panel from literally all across the country. So we have my dear friend, Charlie Teixeira. So she is in Hawaii. Aloha. And mahalo for being here. We appreciate you. And we're going to have them just share with our first question coming up. We have Curtis Griffin, who was actually part of my chapter, who owns Torque Motor Cars. He's basically a concierge service to help folks find it. Actually, Charlie, I'll give you all an opportunity to talk a little bit about what you do. But Curtis, thank you so much for being here. And he's based here in Massachusetts. And then Jane is from my hometown, New York. So Jane also recently joined the chapter success team in New York. So thank you, Jane, so much for joining us here as well. So Charlie, just share with us specifically what region you're in and what it is that you do for work.
Good morning from Hawaii. It's 10 a.m. this morning. I am coming to you from the north shore of the island of Oahu in Hawaii. And I left early this morning because you may have caught on the news that the DEI cow, there's a poster behind me. It's at Waimea Bay. It's a big wave competition. It was supposed to run today, but it got canceled last minute because of the wind. So there are 50-foot waves that are pummeling the North Shore right now. And I've been a part of our North Shore chapter for going on 12 years.
Fantastic. And I got to see Charlie a couple of times when I was out in Hawaii, which is really nice. So fantastic. Thank you so much. And Charlie is also a member of our diversity, equity, and inclusion panel. So thank you for being here. All right, Curtis, why don't you share just a little bit about your region where you're located and your business? Absolutely.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Curtis Griffin. I'm from the greater Boston area. And a little bit about Torque Motor Car. So as Claudia was saying, it's a full service concierge that assists with the buying and selling process for your car. So we handle everything from sourcing, setting up test drives, negotiations, and then ultimately the delivery of your car. And we're able to work nationwide and globally as well.
Fantastic. I've seen you globally. I've seen you international. So yeah. So, and we have global folks who watch this as well. So, so thanks for joining. All right. And then last but not least, we have Jane Parmel. So Jane, why don't you just unmute and share what specific region you're located in and a little bit about your business.
Sure. Thank you again, Claudia, for this opportunity. I'm in New York. I'm in the Rockaways, Queens, New York. Famous, I guess, for the flooding during Sandy and everything else, but a beautiful place to live. And it's like hometown USA. I am in the New York City region. So I guess I'm working with the New York City section of BNI, and my business is Cardinal Profit Strategies. We work with people to make them more money, keep them more happy all the time.
More money and happy is right up my alley. So that's perfect. All right, awesome. Well, thank you again for all joining us here today. So we're going to have this conversation. This is the way that our talks work. This is, we're going to have a question. This first question, I'm already going to request that each of you answer. And then we're going to just, go through and have them. And then at the end of the talk, for those of you that are here, you can pop them in the Q&A specifically. So, and definitely we encourage a lively chat and discussion in the chat. But if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A as you are listening to the conversation. All right. So our first question, okay, is, just share with us about your life before adoption. Okay, so I don't know who would like to share first. And I get that you may not remember what life was like because you might have been an embryo or you might be too young to remember. So I don't know who would like to share first.
I can go first. I was adopted at 5 months old, so I don't know firsthand how my life was before that. I have found out actually recently that there was a very big decision that my birth mom had to make. And that was why it took so long. It was back in the 1960s, a long time ago. So that's what I found out so far, but.
All right, awesome, thank you. And were you in New York, Jane?
Yeah, I was born in Brooklyn, raised in Queens, and then back in Brooklyn now. But yeah, everything stayed in the same area.
Yeah, okay, great, awesome, thank you. Who would like to go? Curtis, unmuted, perfect.
All right. So yeah, kind of like Jane, I was adopted at 2 months old, so not really a lot of background on, where I came from, but recently gathered some information on my biological family. So looking forward to kind of understanding, what those 2 months were like at least.
All right, okay, thank you so much, Curtis. And that was still and you actually did not grow up in Boston.
I did not.
Yes.
I grew up in Maine
Yes, you
and
did.
was adopted from Hayhira, Georgia. So very small town in southern Georgia.
That is almost from the southern tip to the northern tip.
Complete opposite.
Eastern
Complete opposite.
seaboard. Yes, the complete opposite is an understatement. So very, very interesting. And how about you, Charlie?
I was a little bit older when I was adopted. I was adopted at 18 months. I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and I was part of a wave during the 60s, 70s, and 80s of South Koreans being adopted all around the world. There's about 200,000 Korean adoptees worldwide, and the majority of whom are in the United States. And so I was adopted to Michigan. There's a huge hub in the Midwest of Korean adoptees. So it's transnational and transracial. But in Hawaii, some Koreans were adopted here as well. So it's not necessarily transracial, but transnational. So
interesting. Yes. It's funny that you say that, because I know growing up on Staten Island, there were a ton of, I think it was from Russia. And I remember a lot of Russian adoptees coming in during the 80s, in particular, a lot of new kids coming in my class and they were adopted. So yeah, so that is very interesting. And I did not realize that there was such a surge from Korea to the Midwest. So that is always good to know. So, now post-adoption, right? Like after you're with your family, right? How did your adoption affect your understanding of your racial or cultural identity? So I don't know who wants to. I'm gonna volunteer Curtis, because I'm just curious, if you have an answer to this, but how did that affect, right? Because sometimes I feel like maybe Jane, it was kind of easier to, like sometimes it's easier to pass, or like no one, it's like, oh, we don't have to say, we don't have to acknowledge that there's a difference in race. But I think with Curtis was adopted in Maine. And I have been to Maine plenty of times and have been the only one that looks like me. So I didn't see Curtis, but he was evidently there too. So Curtis, I'm just curious about that. How did it affect your understanding of your identity?
I love this question. So yeah, from one small town to another. So I grew up in a very, very small town called Liberty, Maine. It's up near Belfast and Augusta. I think at the time, we may have had 1,000 people in the town. And I was the only Black child adopted by 2 white parents. So of course, that's going to raise a lot of questions in a town like that. And yeah, my parents did the absolute very best they could to make sure that I, kept that identity and was able to understand, as much as they possibly could give, what it was like to be adopted into a white family, and where I come from. And they tried to integrate me into different programs and build out a community of people that looked like me, because I was the only one. And everywhere we go, people would ask questions and say, how can they be your parents? They don't look like you. And you're like, well, I was adopted. You have to explain the whole story and all that fun stuff. But yeah, definitely, I tried to keep that community as close as I could and build it up throughout the years.
Thank you for sharing that, Curtis. Yeah, I can only imagine. Just like I said, my own personal experiences. I did have one friend, Loretta, who grew up in Augusta, who was Black in Maine, but I knew no one else. So yeah,
I didn't have that many friends.
Yeah, I'm like, do you know her? I'm just
no,
kidding.
I do not. I don't. Maybe.
just kidding. So Charlie, is this something that you could answer for us?
So, like Curtis, both of my parents are white. And so when we would walk places, we wouldn't necessarily be identified as a family unit. So that obviously affects us just for, what is considered a family unit. And I think there's a kind of a running joke among at least Korean adoptees for us kind of presenting as bananas, like yellow on the outside, white on the inside, identifying as white because both of our parents are white. But over time, I think actually from help from my mom as well, my adoptive my mom, there's a greater quest to learn and understand Korean culture. So I ended up getting my master's in Korean studies. And so over time, specifically much later, like 20s, 30s, I was more interested in learning about Korean culture, but that certainly wasn't the case during my adolescence.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so interesting. Master's in Korean studies. Wow, that's like that's so interesting. Clearly, your identity had something to do with that, for sure. So that's very fascinating. If Jane, if you don't have anything to respond to this, we can jump to the next question. Now this is about your new family. So did your family support you in your exploration of your racial or cultural identity? And I think, Curtis, you already touched on that. If you had anything else to add, but I'm curious to know. Yeah. Oh, Curtis, you unmuted.
Yeah, no, definitely. My family did support, any questions I had. And, when I took a second to realize that, I do have white parents, and asked them the question, like, why don't I look like you? They were able to explain it and say, you're adopted, but here's why, and kind of walk me through that and help me understand. And then, also I had a different support system. So my family is just this big melting pot. I mean, we have, all different races in the family as well. And I think I have a couple family members on the call today, who are biracial, and, that helped me understand kind of the Black side of the family as well. And, give me kind of a taste of that culture, because, in Maine, we didn't get that. It was, oddly enough, Confederate flags and, things completely different than, the Black culture that I was familiar with. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. I don't know if either Jane or Charlie has anything to add to this.
Well, I mean, I just, in terms of my identity, like you said earlier, I was raised in an Italian and Spanish household, very Mediterranean. My background is actually Guatemalan and Lithuanian, my birth parents. And, so the Spanish end was okay. There was not really much stretch of the identity there. But as far as Lithuanian, any of the Slavic, Baltic, wherever in the world that is, you want to consider, I didn't have any touch with that. So that's been a little bit of an exploration now for me.
Interesting. Yes, I know. And I would say, because I would think of Slavic, there's certain features, again, grew up with a lot of folks who are Eastern European. So the assumption is that that's not the case. I mean, I would say you present mostly as of Latin background, and I don't know if that was the assumption.
Which is the assumption as I got older. Again, where I grew up, it was a melting pot in Astoria, so it was not a question, and it was never my ethnicity as being Hispanic was never actually brought up to me. I was white in a melting pot, Italian, I guess, on upbringing, and even to most recently, maybe 10 years ago, it started because I was in business, so that's when it was pointed.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Let's see. Charlie, I don't know if you had anything to add. Okay. So now, just curious, how have you handled those assumptions based on your race or upbringing? So anyone would like to start, if you take a moment to think about that, but how has it been? How has it been and it's not everyone, this is not applicable necessarily, right, in the case, but based on assumptions of whether your race, but upbringing is another, right? Like someone, Charlie, have people just assumed you are East Asian who grew up in an East Asian household or family, or Curtis, definitely, I want to ask you as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm laughing a little bit because it happened recently, but when I'm on the phone talking with, potential clients or dealerships, wherever, I've been told several times that I present as, white on the phone, and they are completely shocked when I walk into the showroom and I'm like, I'm Curtis. And they're like, you're Curtis? And the amount of times that has happened, it's countless times. So even from, the way I dress to, the way I sound and the certain activities I like to do, I love golfing and all that other stuff. And people are like, oh my God. So yeah, I just laugh it off kind of half the time. It's really, my defense mechanism to say, yeah, well, I was raised in Maine by two white parents. Kind of, what do you expect at that point?
Yeah. I like golf too, and I always have to lead between being a woman and being Black and Latin. I always have to tell people, like, why don't you ask me? Even the guys in the chapter, I'm like, why don't you ask me to go golf? And we just are. I'm like, yeah. I know exactly why, because there's an assumption. So I totally get, but it's interesting that you said that, because they're like, oh, I didn't think you were exposed to those things, right? There's always that assumption. I don't know if someone else has anything to add to this. Yes, Charlie.
I would say the major assumption is in terms of language, that I present as Asian American, so that I should be speaking Korean or some other Asian language. So of course, that kind of brought forth a lot of the ching chongs growing up, in school and whatnot. But I think it's mostly been language. And I tried taking Korean in grad school, and I just am not very good at foreign languages. I know how to say, like, I can go to school, and that's about it. That's the extent of my Korean. So thanks for bringing that up, Claudia, in the question though too.
Yeah, well, I just assume, right? Because that's the, and admittedly, when I first met you, I didn't know you were adopted or like how you were raised. It's just, you see how someone presents. And same for you, Curtis. I think it's just, you meet someone and you just make an assumption that they grew up in a certain household, right? Or around certain people. So I think handling that when it comes your way, quickly being able to respond in a way that's not so, reactive or, something else. But I have not always been that graceful, I have to say. Jane, you unmuted. Were you going to add something?
I was just going to say it's the same thing with me. Everybody assumes I speak Spanish, and to the point that they get like really upset because they think I'm lying, and I'm like, I don't understand you, and they make it based on the assumption what they're seeing in front of them. They just think I should be able to speak. So it's been daunting in business. It does affect it. Personally, not so much, but in business, definitely.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a valid point. And then especially, if you're sitting with a prospective client, like, and they make some of these faux pas, right? And we'll definitely talk about that in a minute, actually. What are some of those microaggressions? Curtis already clearly stated one that I'm used to myself. But what are some of those microaggressions or questions that you've faced in childhood, adulthood, or in your business? So it sounds like all of you have experienced some of the ones that you just shared. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I would just like to add, I came into one thing with business. I was in the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Program, and immediately the assumption was made that I was Hispanic, and I was told by the people in the group, you should go to the Small Business Services. They'll be able to help you get funding. And funny, when I sat with them, I go to fill out the paperwork, and now, as an adoptee, how do you fill out this paperwork? Do you fill it out based on your adoptive family? Do you fill it out based on what you think you might know, genetics, everything else? So, again, the assumptions, I know they mean well sometimes, people, but it's just misplaced sometimes.
Well, I would say that's definitely a microaggression, assuming that you couldn't be part of that program, or you should go to some other
Right.
smaller resources. Yeah, for
I
sure.
wasn't eligible because I didn't have proof. So
Ah, that's
that's the problem.
that. Yeah, that I bet. Charlie.
I'm not sure if this example, I wouldn't consider it necessarily a microaggression. It's more just, I would like greater awareness. And I would think, I would presume that Jane and Curtis can identify this with this. But, you know, speaking of forms, like all the health forms that we have to fill out, we don't have necessarily history of our health background. So I just think that there's enough adoptions going on in the United States where on a business form, you could easily just have a box that says, you know, I'm not aware of my family history. And that kind of ties in with BNI and the health and wellness sector. Like if you're speaking about family health, some of us really just have no idea what our biological makeup is, you know, if we're predisposed for certain diseases, and et cetera. So that's the first thing that came to my mind.
Wow, that is such a good point. That's something that I wouldn't even have thought of. That, yeah, like some people, I know some people know certain things, depending if it's an open adoption or they know more than others, but to make it the assumption that, you know, everyone, biologically is, can be very challenging. So, so thank you for sharing that. So as far as BNI goes, does your story help or hurt as a BNI member, would you say? I'll let not everyone go at once. There you go, Curtis.
I'd say help. I love telling my story. Even the parts that are, you know, more painful to talk about. But I think that creates a very, you know, interesting background and, you know, a really cool narrative to discuss and talk about, and a good talking point. And, you know, overall, I'd say that definitely, you know, helps me as a, you know, BNI member or for former BNI member. Yeah.
How can you say more about that? Like, how do you think it helps specifically?
Just trying to connect with people, I think, and letting them, you know, into my world, and, you know, especially the business I'm in. It's really good to connect with people on that level. I mean, it is kind of in any aspect, but, you know, it's good. I mean, it allows us to be vulnerable and share stories and share backgrounds and learn from each other. And, you know, I love telling my story. You know, as I mentioned, the parts that I'm like, ugh, wish I could skip over that, but it adds to it. And there are parts that were just amazing. You know, I've met some great friends and I have an amazing family and a great support system around me. So, you know, I think telling that story is really important and super valuable.
Yeah, it gives people a new experience too, right?
Mhm.
Because they're used to certain experiences, or people grew up a certain way, or they, you know, a lot of times it's very homogenous in a lot of these chapters. And so, yeah, Curtis, definitely, I could see, and again, based on the activities you enjoy, similar ways of growing up, to them in our chapter, in our case, that makes sense, right? Like then they can say, oh, okay, I wouldn't have normally invited you to do X. But now maybe having that connection. But you also brought up a good point about it automatically has you be vulnerable. And a lot of times people think vulnerable is a bad thing, to be, you know, you can still be more than professional and still open up in a way that has people feel really safe, and open with you, depending, you know, like I think that could be not always the case, but I think if, you know, if you have the opportunity to be vulnerable, at times it could be valuable. Does anyone have anything else to share about this, or your thoughts? I'm curious. And everyone, while we're navigating through these questions, don't forget, if you're here, please, anything, just put it in in the chat, and in the Q&A section. So yes, Jane.
I agree with Curtis wholeheartedly. I think it's just a point of connection. You know, and people become so intrigued. I laugh because Charlie said there's 250,000 Korean adoptees just like in the Michigan area, in the Midwest area. And I laugh because it always sounds like somebody that you meet has never met somebody that was adopted before. And I know there's a lot of us, but it becomes such a novelty that they can't help but ask more questions. And as a member of any networking, especially BNI, it helps make you more approachable.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah. No, that's it. That's such a good point. That is such a good point. Yeah, because then it's just kind of like, oh, wow, okay. You, like I said, it just gets that connection a little bit faster. So yeah, so I want to know now also about one-to-ones. When you're having one-to-ones or working with other BNI members, is there something that can be inclusive of transracial adoptees? What'd you say? I might have stumped you all. If you're thinking about all the one-to-ones, and having those conversations, is there something, and this can kind of tack on to the last question, but do you think that there's something that could be inclusive, or just something that is less, I'm going to make up a word, microaggression-y, something that doesn't seem as triggering?
I'm thinking maybe it would be, I mean, maybe I'm off base with the way the question is worded. I'm a little fuzzy on it, but maybe just in the one-to-ones, it provides an opportunity for the participants to learn about not making those assumptions, to not making those microaggressions, looking at the judging a book by its cover, but really looking deeper. And I think that might be the connection to the one-to-ones. You're supposed to be looking deeper into not just the business aspect of the person, but the person behind it. So I think maybe somehow twisting those things, that's how it might work.
Yeah, no, that's really great. Thank you for that. Yes, Charlie.
I think that maybe inclusivity for me would be possibly a greater sensitivity for some of the questions around adoption. And I think that we all are well-intended, and some of these questions that, as an example, have come from people that have really turned into some really good friends. So it's not something that I don't hold against people at all. But for me personally, and I would speak for some Korean adoptees, not all of them, of course, but I think that when, let's say I say I'm adopted, and the very first response is, oh, you must feel so lucky, or you're very fortunate, that's a trigger for me. And I think it's only because it's not that I don't feel grateful, but typically with people who are adopted, it also comes with some level of trauma from being separated from your birth family. So I think that there's possibly maybe a different time to talk about how fortunate we are. And so that comes to mind. And also just a question, which even though Jane and Curtis readily said at the very beginning, like to ask someone very quickly on, like, have you searched for your birth family? I mean, I've met someone just in BNI, and that's been the very first question they've asked me. And that's a little jarring to me personally. It is, I think, very personal. And now, after being asked that question a million times, I have an answer that's not so like, it doesn't like rip the scar off me. I can answer it, without crying in front of the person. So, but, it's just something to be maybe more sensitive about.
So you said so many great things. Thank you for sharing that, Charlie. I'm, just as a DEI educator and speaker, right? I'm always, and someone who has been had every microaggression thrown at her. I'm just very hypersensitive to making sure people don't feel excluded, right? That everything is inclusive as possible. And so some of the things, this is an area that I'm not super well versed in. And I love that you said that about, even saying like, you must be so lucky, like you had, however, right? Even with birth parents, you just don't know how someone was brought up, right? You don't know what their experience was or their situation, or you just have no idea, right? Go ahead, Jane.
And just going to what Charlie said, my favorite question is always, oh, did you ever look for your real parents? And you know, that's, I think one of the most jarring things is the fact that the family that you're brought up in are your real everything, parents, grandparents, cousins, you name it. And so that, to me, I just, you know, piggybacking on what Charlie said, that's one of the most, I think, hurtful questions, and people tend to lead in with that.
Yeah,
I would agree
yeah,
with
go
you, Jane, too. That's one of the first questions I usually get. And I throw it back and say, well, the family that raised me, that is my real family. They're real parents, and they're shook. They don't know what to say. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. I'm like, no, it's okay. And then they say, oh, well, have you searched for your family, like you said, Charlie? And I'm like, well, yes, we can dive into that, but there's a lot there. But yeah, definitely. I mean, especially Maine, the amount of questions I would get around that are just unbelievable. And still to this day, you know, I can drive through my hometown and stop at the gas station to fill up, and everyone kind of looks at me funny, and they're like, oh, are you from here? I'm like, I am from here, actually. And like, oh, like, you know, whose kid are you? And I start saying like, oh, cool. Like, so are they your real parents, or what happened? And it's just, yeah.
I am trying not to get triggered. Okay, so yeah, so this, yeah. I mean, so these are some of the things. Hopefully people at home are taking note on this, because this really is, we just have to be thoughtful. Just because your friend who was adopted is cool with these questions too, doesn't mean that someone else who's an adoptee is going to be okay with questions. We also have to keep that in mind as well, right? So these are really good points. I appreciate you all doing the labor today for folks in your situation, and you're all a little bit different, you know, with you know, your families and your stories. So this hopefully will be helpful. So now we're going to jump into some Q&A. Then I see that a question popped in the chat. And if you have any other questions here, please, folks, feel free. It looks like, is it the same question? It is the same question. Okay. So Sandra asked, what is the best reaction when you learn someone is adopted? So I don't know who wants to answer that. And I don't know if Sandra means the person, like if I find someone is, or if when you find someone else. So I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I'll let you answer, Charlie, for what you think it is.
I think that's such a good question, because as I was driving over here and I was thinking of like what wasn't so great to say, it didn't cross my mind, like, what would I tell someone to say? So thanks for asking that question. The best thing that I could think of, which would be just something like, perhaps like we'll find out more about your adoption identity as we get to know each other more. That's the only thing that came into my mind.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, to find out. Also, because do you just say, oh, or ignore it if you, and don't come off as dumb or inconsiderate? So that's to elaborate. Someone else unmuted. I think it was it Jane? I'm not sure who. Someone did, but yeah, so basically, so that's, yeah, that's okay. So that's good. I know it's kind of tricky. Go ahead, Jade.
I mean, no, I don't even know how you would respond. I mean, I've gotten everything from OG to, you know, I would say most people just not fluff it off, but just like, oh, wow, that's interesting. You know, especially in the business context, what Charlie said in the business context, I think is fantastic. Personally, I think it gets a little more muddled, but I think Charlie's response is perfect for that.
Great.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that too. It definitely, you know, Jane, I hear that response quite often. It's like, oh, interesting, let's dive in more. And I'm like, not now, like another time.
Yeah, tell me everything. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I definitely find it fascinating, right? And my brain starts to go, because I'm trying to think of when each of you told me that you were, because you all did. And so and I'm just like, oh, cool. Like, you know, I just have questions from this perspective, particularly around this topic, like, well, what was that like for you, you know, in my head. And also being thoughtful of not overwhelming someone, and trying to avoid triggers. I think that's key. Anytime that you can do that, for sure. We don't have any other questions at the moment. I didn't know if any of you had any resources for folks, like any podcasts or books or tips or tools, like any final thoughts that you wanted to leave before we head out? If you can think of anything.
I think it's just important that, whatever the situation is, good, bad, otherwise, however you might want to frame it, you have to be comfortable. It has to happen at the right time for you to be able to share. And you have to be comfortable with your story and not the overwhelming parts of it, but maybe just have something in your wheelhouse so that you're able to share and people can grow an appreciation for interacting with people. That the conversation is not always that easy. So
Yeah, no, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's not, I mean, I can always imagine that, because once that comes up, I can imagine. Well, if I just want to say thank you all for being here on this topic, and sharing yourselves so vulnerably and openly. And we really appreciate it. And hopefully for our BNI family beyond where you're all located, our members, our directors, coaches, community, and hopefully we can help be a little bit more, willing to listen differently and have more thoughtful conversations. So thank you all so much. So next month, we are really excited. It is another February, so it's Black History Month. So we have a whole new panel. Last year, we had 5 amazing people again from across the country and even outside of the country. So plan on that happening again. So we have 5 folks. We have that, I believe that if I know Steve, he dropped that in the chat. He sure did. So that link is there so you can register. And if you have anything else, and then we have Women's History Month after that. And then we're going to talk about equitable housing, in April for Real Estate Housing Month. So definitely you don't want to miss these conversations coming up. If you know folks that might be interested in the panel, please let us know. And we will see you next month on Wednesday, February 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next month.